this talk started with me having some time on my hands by being unemployed. So I was reading my news feed a little bit more than usual. And over the last couple of months, you may have been reading the same stories that I have, and they're pretty disturbing about the Republican Party and Trump really setting up a whole plan to steal the election in 2024 by passing laws in Republican legislature dominated states. This paired with tons of bills that are being passed to restrict voting rights. And the lovely salad is complete with total gridlock in the Senate because of the filibuster, and Democrats not being able to not only protect voting rights with legislation, but really pass anything else progressive. And I was sitting there, and along with harboring violent fantasies about Joe Manchin, which maybe you had as well, I was really frustrated by the coverage. It was really stressful to think about what was happening, all these rights being stolen away in the Republican plan, but also the coverage. Some of the editorials seemed to just already be giving up the fight. They were really fatalistic, like democracy is dying, or more like democracy is already dead. And the question was already resolved. Or journalists were doing really great work digging into what exactly was happening with Trump and the plan and the erosion of rights, but they didn't have any sort of plan of what to do. How could we push this back? Like, how could we deal with this really disturbing problem? So I thought a little bit of history could help us understand what was going on, where this crisis in democracy came from, how it really has a basis in our economic system. It's a crisis of our democratic system, but it's also a crisis of our economic system. And talk about how we can really defend our rights, like what we can do to push back these attacks on fundamental rights like the right to vote. So I read this book called Democracy and Revolution. It's by George Novak, who was an activist and a Marxist theoretician and author. He has a lot of really excellent, very accessible books. But Democracy and Revolution is about democracy in class society. So it takes a look at how it arose, starting with ancient Greek society, and then also democracy's rise and decline in the US under capitalism. So before we get to the decline part, spoiler alert, we are in the decline of democracy under US capitalism. I want to first talk about the chapter which Novak calls the revolutionary chapter of US democracy. So who else, show of hands, has gone to public school in this country like I have? All right, so you probably learned that democracy came about in an idealist way, which is to say that it was an idea that kind of emerged in the brilliant brains of the founding fathers, and they had these ideas, they spoke them to the people, everyone thought it was a great idea, joined the revolution, and the rest is history. Well, Novak takes a different approach to this. He looks at democracy's beginning and the economic or materialist reasons that it came about. So he explains how in the colonies there was a growing merchant or capitalist class, and the crown, England, was really getting in their way. There was heavy taxes, restricted trade routes, and so this growing capitalism was really being held back by feudalism, by the monarchy. And this early capitalist class knew that they need to get rid of the crown. They needed to create their own country in order for their system to flourish. The impediments of the monarchy were too getting in the way, but they knew they couldn't do it alone. They needed the masses of people in the colonies to help them. So the program really offered the masses individual freedoms: life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. Pursuit of happiness, of course, meaning the freedom to make money and for capitalism to thrive. And so they struck this deal with the masses. Let's make a revolution. Everybody will be free. And by and large, it worked. The masses, led by the revolutionary leadership of the early capitalists, made the revolution, overthrew the British Empire. And what they established really was objectively the most progressive democracy of the time for those who benefited from it. So then Novak talks more about this chapter of revolutionary democracy, and he explains something that I think is also really different from the way you learn it in public school, which is that the Civil War really was an extension of the first American Revolution. Because even though the early capitalists had thrown off the crown, there was still this problem in the South. The rich cotton empire there really competed with the industrial forces in the North. And the slave economy was not only horrific, it was feudal, it was economically backwards, and it was getting in the way of economic evolution of the country. So again, the Northern capitalists needed to get rid of this Southern feudal slave state, but they couldn't do it alone. They needed both the Union Army and they needed to free the slaves to fight to win the revolution. And again, they succeeded. They offered the masses of slaves freedom in exchange for helping to give victory to the Northern industrialists and make sure capitalism was the law of the land with nothing in its way. So again, I don't know about you, but this is a different version of the Civil War that I learned when Jed, Zach, and I, and my other brother and sister were Civil War reenactors. Look at those hats. So anyway, Democracy and Revolution concludes that this was the progressive era of democracy, and it pretty much all goes downhill from there. Now that the industrialists had got the British off their backs, they've defeated the slave empire in the South, capitalism is now free to expand westward and liberty and justice for all. But of course, there's a little bit of a problem. There's a contradiction in this system, in this setup from the very beginning. Because what was established wasn't just democracy, it was capitalist or bourgeois democracy. And so Novak really explains this contradiction well in a quote from his book. The nominal equality of all citizens is at odds with the actual inequalities of American society. The owners of wealth wield far more power than the rest of the population. They constitute an oligarchy which exercises social tyranny behind the facade of representative democracy. He goes on to say, put it in pretty blunt terms, where he says, the actual practices of every bourgeois or capitalist democracy have violated the most elementary tests of equality. And so how else can you really explain, sorry, I went forward. How else can you explain that the founding fathers had slaves, or the fact that in the first elections for quite some time, only propertied white male could vote in the first elections? So we all know when we look at the history objectively that contradictions did exist in our democracy from the very beginning. But of course, this wasn't set in stone. As the country evolved, the class struggle still happened within the bourgeois democratic system. Advances have been made because of rule from below, like, you know, among other democratic rights, voting rights for Blacks and women. These were all fought for by the working class, but they weren't given in an alliance like they were in the first Civil War and in the Revolution and the Civil War. They were wrested from the ruling class as concessions. And now these rights that we fought for over the years are really being stripped away. And why is this happening? Why isn't our country just evolving and becoming more and more democratic as people understand that equality is a good idea and understand that people deserve rights? Well, because as capitalism develops, it centralizes, and then it finally reaches a crisis, as all outdated social systems do, it becomes less and less tolerant of democratic rights. Novak says, a representative democracy is alien to the economic tendencies of corporate capitalism. The advent of monopoly rule not only halts the extension of new freedoms, but it also brings about the contraction of already acquired rights of the people. I think you can agree we're feeling like there's a contraction of rights right now. And he explains, as capitalism becomes global, which of course it's been global for a long time now, it only gets worse. Imperialism accentuates the contradiction which existed from the first between the coexistence of the power, profiteering, and property of the capitalist rulers and political democracy. It inescapably fosters anti-democratic forces and trends because the heightened centralization of command required by the operations of big business in both production and political life conflicts with the dispersion of power among the voters and parties on which the parliamentary system rests. So understanding our system from this angle makes all of the current crisis in democracy pretty predictable. As I was reading it, I was really found it remarkable how Novak just clearly described what's happening today. And I began to understand even deeper why we can see our system doesn't just get more and more democratic as time goes on. There's advances by our class for more rights, but there's also losses. We also move backwards. One example of this is Reconstruction, giving rights to the freed slaves, and then it turns into Jim Crow to deeply restrict and segregate and oppress them. And those early Northern industrialists have turned into an even smaller, more powerful, concentrated minority of capitalist rulers at the top. This chart to me is pretty staggering. It shows the concentration of wealth and how even in the pandemic, during the crisis, it's really skyrocketed in an incredible way. So corporations are also merging into more and more monopolies. And this isn't just creating stability at the top, it creates instability, dysfunction, and there's even more of a need to make sure that the people at the bottom don't rise up. So now I want to talk about some of the dysfunctions and barriers and features of modern bourgeois democracy or capitalist democracy, and how they actually have their origins in this very beginnings and setup of the system itself. So many of the barriers to reform have been put in place a long time ago to weaken the power of the people. For example, the Electoral College was there in the Constitution from the very beginning. It did not give the popular vote the power to elect the president. It distributed it among the states, specifically because the founding fathers were worried about masses of people picking the wrong candidate, and they wanted to deflect and water down the power of the people. And this is really important to understand because this is the playbook that the GOP and Trump are using right now. They want local legislatures in Republican-dominated states that are swing states to be able to overturn the will of the popular vote by nominating their own electors. That's what so many of these bills do. They give the local reactionary legislatures in states the power to overturn the voters. It's essentially states' rights, and it goes back to really reactionary principles and elements of our democracy. And then we can look at the filibuster, which of course has been such a huge part of blocking legislation and reform. It has a completely undemocratic history. The most famous and longest of the filibusters came during the civil rights era to prevent the end of Jim Crow. These features really do come from, are designed to stop revolt from below. And one perfect example that's more current is when the Democrats were in the Senate were talking about repealing the filibuster and getting rid of it. The Chamber of Commerce, which is basically an alliance of all the capitalist corporate interests in the country, pushed really hard and put pressure on senators to keep the filibuster because they knew it would prevent the passage of the PRO Act, which is a very progressive piece of pro-union legislation that makes it easier to form unions. So this is just a perfect crystal clear example of how the filibuster helps the capitalists and hurts workers. One really important element, of all of these attacks on our rights is how they're racist. And they really show how the specific fear that the ruling class has of Black political working class power. Of course, voting restrictions target Black voters, and states' rights have always upheld white supremacy because they give power to reactionary politicians and they really take it away from more populist and multiracial areas. So this chart shows perfectly how the power of people of color is diffused by the Electoral College and the power of white voters is stronger. And we know it's not just voting rights that are under attack. At the same time as they are, we're losing the right to abortion, trans kids are under attack, books are being banned. And these attacks are all part of the crisis in democracy because they really divide the working class and strengthen the power at the top. Novak also writes about how as a capitalist democracy becomes more unstable, power gets centralized in the executive branch. And the former parliamentary or democratic practices, they get thrown off. And this is what Novak calls Bonapartism, which is named after Napoleon Bonaparte. And maybe some of you read the story that I did about how Trump and his advisors were playing with a plan after the election of how they could use the military to seize voting machines under the pretext that China hacked them. This really is a perfect example of Bonapartism, of an executive branch taking more and more power and using the military to do it. Not only that, but the threat of fascism grows. And one kind of element of fascism is that as capitalism reaches crisis, it tinkers or considers fascist option to save itself. And one thing that fascism needs is a mass base to pull it off. And right now, Trump is really fostering a mass base of disaffected, middle class, pissed off people. That's who was at January 6th. And that's who's really pushing that agenda in school board meetings and harassing election officials. So it's really important to see that that growth and that strategy is a part of a trend towards fascism, and it's really dangerous. Of course, the two-party system is a huge part of the problem too. This wasn't present from the beginning. Political parties weren't in the ideas of the founding fathers. But quickly, the rich realized this is a great tool for deceiving people into thinking they had a party looking out for them and helping prevent them from understanding that it's really a class conflict. And the Democratic Party is just as tied to capitalism. And in fact, this is an older capitalist party than even the Republicans. And the struggle between these two parties is really because they represent different sectors of the ruling class and they just want power. This chart really illustrates this. It's corporate political action committee donations to Democrats and Republicans. And in a lot of sectors, the Democrats have even more donations. This is from February last year, after Republicans took a little bit of a hit after the 6th, and then donations eventually coming flooding back to them. When you understand this class allegiance of the Democratic Party, you can understand why they're unwilling to defend democracy if it means stepping outside of the limited legalistic means they have. Of course, they'll call investigative panels, they'll have impeachment trials, they'll speak out at the press, they'll be on MSNBC. But what else could they do besides that? Well, stepping outside those limited tactics, they would have to call a mass movement. They would have to call out us to get us to organize and mobilize in our own name for our own rights. But they won't do that because they're scared of the working class having power. And that would get in the way of their deal that they cut with the people at the top. So revolutionary socialists and maybe the rest of us say, is this the best we can do? I think the answer is no. Capitalism and this fake democracy have been around a long time, and they've been around long enough. Socialists believe in the idea of a workers' democracy. This is where the vast majority has the democratic control over the wealth and the resources, and we can make a decent life for everybody and protect the planet. It's not just about the right to vote who represents you. We would be able to prioritize things like getting the lead out of water before we fund space shuttle missions for the rich. We would focus on saving the environment and making sure everyone had healthcare before we gave billions to a polluting military industrial complex. But of course, we need new ways to organize ourselves to do this. Expecting that democratic politicians will help create socialism and workers' democracy is like asking the king and queen to help get rid of feudalism. First, we definitely need to fight to preserve what democratic rights we have, because we can't win a new system without those democratic rights to help us fight. We need to protest all of this repressive legislation, stand up for the right to vote and the right to have a First Amendment. But if we want a workers' democracy, we need to bring the working class together in our own formations. This means joining unions and grassroots formations like the ECRB campaign. And in the electoral arena, it means running independent working class candidates that have no ties to either capitalist party. They can tell the truth, paint the system for what it is, and help educate and mobilize people. And unfortunately, it's not just enough to elect enough socialists to Congress to overturn the system. If we don't change the economic system underneath our democratic system, our rights will always be under threat. What we need is a deeper revolutionary transformation. The Freedom Socialist Party is a revolutionary party because we want to support this mission, this fight, this evolution of our country in whatever way we can. We do it in our work in the labor movement, in the abortion and reproductive justice movement, in our fight for police accountability, and also in our advocacy for the ideas of socialism and for the ideas of socialist revolution. Just as the racist right wing seems to be the South rising again, we have faith that the multiracial working class will rise again too. We can continue the brave fights of the first revolutions that threw off the king and slavery, and we can continue the mission of everyone who's fought for rights since then. I hope that you'll join us in this fight, because reading Novak's book really reminded me that fighting for revolution against tyrants is a very proud and important part of our American tradition. Thank you.